Well, good morning. How's everyone doing? Well, this week, it's an important week, and it's kind of in some ways, a week I look forward to, as it's very historical and important. It's also a week I'm embarrassed about, for America, for our country. We're going to learn about slavery a lot. We've already learned some things about it. We don't leave it alone. It's not isolated to one week. But most of the week will be on slavery. We'll do a little bit about Daniel Boone as well, which is so we can at least have some positive. So this will be mostly about America's colonies, how they started with slavery in the English colony. England started it, and so we're going to learn about that time in our history. Very sad part of our history that we have to come to grips with. This really happened. It's kind of hard to believe for us. We're like, what? I don't get it. It's like, what? But yes, this did exist. It existed mostly in the South, but it was here too. There were slaves in Massachusetts at the beginning. Tituba was a slave. She wasn't treated very well. So we've got to learn about that so we can learn the truth and about our country and how to fix it. All right, so this one is about Carry Me Back to Old Virginny. It's going to discuss Virginia too, but then it'll go into slavery. All right, so let's read. Chapter 31, Carry Me Back to Old Virginny. I haven't said much about Virginia since John Smith's time, and that's too bad, because some future presidents were getting born there. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Virginia's John Marshall, George Mason, and Patrick Henry were destined for greatness, too. Was there something about Virginia that bred leaders? Life there was certainly different from life in Pennsylvania or Massachusetts. Most people in 18th century Virginia weren't Puritans or Quakers, they were Anglicans, members of the Church of England. But they were more relaxed about their religion than the Puritans. In the New England colonies, the ministers were the most important people in the community. In the South, the wealthy landowners were the more important. The Virginians didn't live in towns as people did in Massachusetts. They lived along the rivers on small farms or on very large farms called plantations. Living on the river made shipping easy. That was important. What Virginians were shipping was tobacco to England. Well, a few other crops were grown. The main money maker was tobacco. That was a problem. When tobacco prices were high, Virginians did well. When tobacco prices fell, they were in trouble. There was no balance. There was little industry, and most goods came from England. In this land of magnificent forests, even fine furniture and other wood products were shipped from the mother country. There was another problem. Tobacco uses up the soil. After a few years, nothing grows well on land that has been planted with tobacco. To succeed in a tobacco economy, you need to rest the land every few years. And that means you need to own a lot of land. You also need many workers. So, tobacco growers in colonial Virginia began to buy land and workers. As you know, at first they bought indentured servants, then they bought Africans and made them slaves. By 1750, there were more Africans in Virginia than any other single group of people. More Virginians had come from Africa than from England or Scotland. It was a few rich white planters who held power in the colony. Most whites were small farmers, and there were thousands of them. Some owned a slave or two, or hoped to. That made them go along with the big slave owners. Virginia was not the only place where this happened. A society built on slavery stretched from Maryland to Virginia. Slavery was not only terrible for the black slaves, it ruined many white farmers too. At first, the South, like the North, was full of yeoman farmers. Yeomen are independent farmers who work their own land. When slave ships began bringing in large numbers of Africans, the yeomen were in trouble. The blacks, being slaves, were forced to work for nothing. The yeoman farmers couldn't compete with that. The tobacco they grew was more expensive than tobacco grown by slaves. The yeoman farmers had these choices. They could stay in Virginia, or Maryland, or the Carolinas, or Georgia, and try to work their own farms. Usually that meant they would become poor whites, or they could buy slaves. Or they could head west to the frontier and settle new land, and perhaps fight Indians for that land. These were difficult choices. By the 18th century, most slave owners were beginning to realize that slavery was wrong. Many spoke out against it. They also made excuses and tried to justify enslaving others. They knew that every ancient society had included slaves. Many white people realized they were trapped in a bad system. They didn't know how to get out. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and many others wrote that slavery was evil, but they owned slaves. If you were a plantation owner and you freed your slaves, you might become poor. All right, you would become poor. There's no might involved. So, might your family? What would you do? I wonder. For a decent person, the problem was even more difficult than you can imagine. Many white Virginians had been very poor back in England or wherever their parents came from. Many had been let out of jail if they agreed to come to America. They knew what it was like to be oppressed, and many didn't want anything to do with slavery. But in some places, it was against the law to free your slaves. In some places, it was against the law for black people to own land. It was against the law to teach black people how to read. Many slave owners believed that if they freed their slaves, there would be no way for the slaves to survive. Most would not be able to find jobs. They might starve. They might be kidnapped and sold again into slavery. A few whites did free their slaves. Some tried to end slavery. Most did nothing. What would you have done? I wonder. Imagine that you are a slave owner. You control other people's lives. You can order them around. You can have them whipped. You can taunt them. Do you think you might become mean and lazy? Do you think you might turn into a bad-tempered tyrant? Some slave owners were all of those things. Some of them were among the meanest people in America's history. But there were others who felt great responsibility for their slaves. There is a paradox connected with slavery. A paradox is a puzzle. Something very puzzling happened in colonial Virginia. When it came time to write a constitution for our nation, it was the slave-owning Virginians who thought and wrote most about freedom. That is the paradox. Why do you think it was so? So a couple of things I want to unpack there. This thing about feeling great responsibility for the slaves. Yeah, they probably, some did. I bet most did. It doesn't matter. You can't like, you treat slaves well. It's interesting. You're still having them be slaves. They can't be free. You control them. What's interesting is this is a known way they talk to slaves. This is how you talk to a slave. If a slave helping you out was a man, you would say, "Good boy. You're a good boy. You're always a good boy. Thanks for helping." Or a woman cooking for you, "You're a good girl." They talk to you like a dog or a pet. That's your best option as a slave, being treated like a good pet. That's the best. There's no good slave owning. I mean, some were better than others. I mean, some didn't whip, some tried to keep families together. Notice I use the word tried. So the whole thing's bad. You can't have, good slave owners. Like, no. Again, some are worse. Some are the kind you read about or heard about. Probably many were. So that's something I wanted to unpack there. There's no like good slave, No. Now, also paradox. I know that's a big word. That's okay. You can use paradox. Don't be afraid of it. It just means it's a puzzle. It's weird. Why? Why is that unusual? So why is it weird that Virginians who owned slaves complained about freedom, even breaking away from England? You can't chain me like a slave. But, what do you do? Interesting. All right, so that's eventually that paradox, that'll be your work for tomorrow. Today, you'll be just making a map of Virginia. It's a map quiz of Virginia. And then tomorrow we're going to learn more about slavery, and you're going to answer that question. And I also asked for your views on slavery. And you can answer that anyway. I mean, it's hard. I can't imagine slavery really being a positive view. So don't do that. But what are your views on it? I want to hear your opinion about it. All right. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye, guys.